Welcome, I'm John, and today I'm going to tell you an exciting story. Millionaire catches cleaning, lady eating leftovers and takes action that changes everything. The iron gate creaked shut with a finality that echoed through the quiet cul-de-sac of Laurelhurst, one of Seattle's most exclusive neighborhoods. MARIAH Evans stood on the freshly paved driveway, her second-hand Toyota looking out of place among the shadows of luxury vehicles that usually grace this property. She clutched her worn purse tighter against her side, taking in the sprawling estate before her, a modern fortress of glass and stone, hidden behind tall hedges that seemed designed to keep the world at bay. The mansion belonged to Jonathan Blake, though she'd only seen him twice in the 3 weeks since she'd been hired. He was a shadow that moved through hallways, a presence felt more than seen. The half-empty coffee cup left on the study desk, the untouched breakfast plate, the faint scent of expensive cologne lingering in rooms he'd just vacated. MARIAH had learned about him through fragments, a tech entrepreneur who'd sold his company for millions, a widower who rarely left his home office, a man the other staff members spoke of in hushed, careful tones. "He's not unkind," the previous housekeeper had told her during the brief handover. "He's just absent." She understood absent. She'd become familiar with it in the faces of landlords who wouldn't meet her eyes when she asked for an extension on rent, in the social workers who shuffled papers instead of listening, in her own reflection some mornings when exhaustion made her a stranger to herself. The October air carried a bite as MARIAH made her way through the service entrance, punching in the code she'd memorized on her first day. Inside, the kitchen greeted her with its gleaming marble countertops and commercial-grade appliances, a temple to culinary possibilities that felt sacred and untouchable. She'd grown up in a cramped apartment in Tacoma where 4 people shared a bathroom and the stove only worked on 3 burners. This kitchen alone was larger than her current living room. She tied on her apron and began her routine, wiping down surfaces that already sparkled, organizing spaces that held a museum-like order, moving through rooms where her footsteps seemed too loud against the hardwood floors. In the great room, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Lake Washington, the water gray and choppy under threatening clouds. A Steinway grand piano sat untouched in the corner, its surface dustless, but somehow conveying abandonment. Everywhere she looked, she saw money, but nowhere did she see life. In the study, MARIAH found evidence of Jonathan's morning, a laptop still open to a series of stock market graphs, a leather notebook with indecipherable notes, a framed photograph face down on the desk. She'd been instructed never to touch personal items, but something about that photograph called to her. Her hand hovered over it before she pulled back, respecting the boundary between their worlds. By noon, her stomach had begun its familiar protest, a hollow ache she'd learned to ignore. She'd given Tyler the last of the cereal that morning, watching him eat while she sipped black coffee and pretended she'd already eaten. He was 7, bright-eyed and full of questions she couldn't always answer. Questions like, why can't we get pizza like Marcus's family? Or, when will we go on vacation? Questions that required resources she simply didn't have. She had 4 hours before her evening shift at the diner started. 4 hours to make this mansion perfect, to be invisible and efficient, to not think about the fact that she hadn't eaten a proper meal in 2 days. At 3 o'clock, as instructed, MARIAH prepared Jonathan's lunch, a gourmet pasta dish with grilled chicken, following the meal plan left by his private chef, who only came on weekends. She plated it carefully, added a side salad with the specified dressing, and left it in the warming drawer of the kitchen island. At 6 when she returned to clean up, the plate sat untouched, the pasta cold and congealed. She stared at it for a long moment, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for the container. In her world, this single meal represented a luxury: organic ingredients, careful preparation, more protein than she usually ate in a week, and it was going to be thrown away. MARIAH glanced around the empty kitchen. The security camera's red light blinked steadily in the corner, but she'd been told they were rarely monitored. Mr. Blake was upstairs in his office. The house was silent, except for the hum of expensive appliances. Her pride warred with her hunger. She'd never taken anything from an employer before, never. But Tyler needed new shoes, the electric bill was overdue, and her body was beginning to weaken from skipped meals. Just this once, she told herself. Just this once. MARIAH's hands shook as she opened the refrigerator, the cool air washing over her flushed face. She told herself she was just checking the inventory, doing her job, but her eyes had already found the container. The pasta she'd carefully plated hours ago, now relegated to a clear Tupperware box among a dozen other forgotten meals. She pulled it out, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain it echoed through the cavernous kitchen. The marble countertop felt cold against her palms as she set the container down, staring at it like it might suddenly speak, might judge her for what she was about to do. "Just take it home," a voice in her head whispered. "You can say you're disposing of it properly." But she was so hungry, the kind of hungry that made her lightheaded, that turned the world slightly unfocused at the edges. She'd worked a double shift at the diner yesterday, smiled through orders and cleaned tables while her stomach ate itself from the inside. She'd given Tyler the last packet of instant oatmeal that morning, watched him add too much water because they were running low, and told him Mommy had already eaten. She always told him she'd already eaten. Mariah grabbed a fork from the drawer, not the expensive silverware, just one of the everyday ones from the staff section, and moved to stand by the sink. Her back was to the main kitchen, facing the window that looked out onto the darkened garden. If someone came in, she could pretend she was washing dishes, doing something legitimate. The first bite was almost painful. Her body, deprived for so long, seemed shocked by actual sustenance. The pasta was cold, the sauce congealed, but it tasted like salvation. She ate quickly, mechanically, her eyes welling with tears she hadn't given herself permission to shed. This was what her life had become. 36 years old, college degree abandoned in her second year when she got pregnant, standing in someone else's mansion eating their garbage while her son waited at home with a babysitter she could barely afford. The tears came harder now, silent but insistent. She kept eating, kept chewing, unable to stop even as shame burned hot in her chest. She thought of her mother, who'd cleaned houses her whole life and never took a single thing that wasn't offered. "We may not have much, but we have our dignity," she used to say. What would she think of Mariah now? The container was half empty when Mariah heard it, a slight creak from the hallway. She froze, fork halfway to her mouth, her entire body rigid with fear. She waited, counting her heartbeats, but heard nothing else. The house settled around her, full of its expensive silence. She forced herself to finish quickly, washed the container and fork with trembling hands, and placed them in the drying rack. Evidence erased, dignity intact, or at least disguised. Upstairs, in his home office, Jonathan Blake sat in front of a bank of monitors that displayed various angles of his property. He'd been reviewing security footage from the previous week. A break-in 2 streets over had made him paranoid. When movement in the kitchen camera caught his eye, he watched Mariah standing by the sink, her back hunched in a way that suggested she was trying to make herself smaller. At first he thought she was washing dishes, but then he noticed what she was holding. The container from his uneaten lunch, the fork moving to her mouth in quick, furtive movements. Jonathan's hand hovered over the keyboard, ready to zoom in, to confirm what he was seeing. But something about her posture stopped him. The curve of her shoulders, the way she kept glancing around like a frightened animal. And then he saw her wipe her face with the back of her hand. She was crying. He leaned back in his leather chair, a strange tightness forming in his chest. For 5 years, he'd insulated himself from other people's pain, from any emotion that might crack the careful numbness he'd constructed after Sarah's death. He paid people well, treated them fairly in a transactional sense, and asked nothing of them except that they leave him alone. But now he'd seen something he wasn't supposed to see, something raw and human that made it impossible to unsee Mariah as just the housekeeper. She was hungry. In his home, surrounded by more food than one person could ever need, his employee was hungry enough to risk her job for a container of cold pasta. The realization sat heavy in his stomach, undigested and uncomfortable. Jonathan closed the security feed, but the image of Mariah remained burned into his mind, her quiet desperation, her careful shame. He thought of the meals he barely touched, the groceries that expired in his sub-zero refrigerator, the casual waste that had become his normal. When had he stopped seeing people? When had their struggles become background noise to his own carefully maintained isolation? He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat in his darkened office, watching the city lights reflect off Lake Washington, and thought about what he would say when morning came, because he couldn't unsee what he'd witnessed, and something told him that pretending he hadn't would be worse than any confrontation. Morning arrived with a cruelty that felt personal. Mariah had barely slept, her mind replaying the moment in the kitchen over and over, each iteration adding new details to her shame. Had she closed the refrigerator too loudly? Had she left any evidence behind? Would Mr. Blake notice the container had been used? She'd checked her phone obsessively throughout the night, expecting a message terminating her employment. By the time dawn broke over Tacoma, painting her cramped apartment in shades of gray, she'd convinced herself that walking into the Blake mansion today would be walking toward her own execution, but she had no choice. She needed this job. Tyler needed new shoes. His toes were cramping in the old ones. The electricity bill was 3 days past due, and Mrs. Chen at the diner had cut everyone's hours because business was slow. Mariah dropped Tyler at school, held him a moment longer than usual, breathing in the scent of the discount shampoo she'd watered down to make it last. "Love you, baby," she whispered into his hair. "Love you too, Mama," he said, squirming free with the easy resilience of childhood. "Can we have spaghetti tonight?" The word spaghetti sent a spike of nausea through her. "We'll see, sweetheart." The drive to Laurelhurst felt longer than usual, each mile weighted with dread. When she pulled up to the iron gate and entered her code, she half expected it not to work, to find herself locked out with her belongings in a box by the service entrance. But the gate opened. The house stood unchanged, imposing and beautiful in the morning light. Inside, everything appeared normal. The kitchen was exactly as she'd left it, clean, organized, pristine. Mariah moved through her morning routine with robotic precision, dusting surfaces that didn't need dusting, arranging items that were already perfectly arranged. She was hyper-aware of every sound, every footstep from the floors above. At 10 o'clock, she heard it, the deliberate tread of dress shoes on hardwood, moving with purpose toward the kitchen. Jonathan Blake appeared in the doorway, and for the first time since she'd been hired, they were in the same room with nowhere for either of them to hide. He was taller than she'd realized, with the kind of lean build that came from expensive gym memberships and personal trainers. His hair, graying at the temples, was uncombed, unusual for him. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. He wore jeans and a wrinkled button-down shirt, casual in a way that seemed almost vulnerable. "Mrs. Evans," he said, his voice neutral. "Could we talk for a moment?" The world tilted slightly. Mariah gripped the edge of the counter to steady herself. "Of course, Mr. Blake." He gestured toward the breakfast nook, a small alcove with a round table and chairs that overlooked the garden. She'd never sat there, had never sat anywhere in this house except occasionally on the floor when she scrubbed baseboards. They sat across from each other, the marble table between them feeling like a courtroom bench. Jonathan was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming once against the table before he stilled them. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she expected. "Last night, I was reviewing security footage. There was a break-in in the neighborhood, and I was checking the perimeter cameras." Mariah's heart stopped. She couldn't breathe, couldn't move. This was it. "I saw you," he continued, his eyes meeting hers directly. "In the kitchen, with the pasta from my lunch." The shame that flooded through her was so intense it was physical. She wanted to disappear, to sink through the floor, to cease existing. Her hands twisted in her lap, and she couldn't bring herself to look at him. "Mr. Blake, Her voice cracked. "I'm so sorry. I've never done anything like that before. I swear. I'll pay you back. I'll work extra hours. Why didn't you just ask?" The question was so unexpected that Mariah's prepared speech died in her throat. She looked up and found his expression not angry, but genuinely confused. "If you needed food, why didn't you ask?" The question was so absurd, so disconnected from her reality, that Mariah almost laughed. Ask the millionaire tech entrepreneur if she could have his leftovers. "I couldn't," she whispered. "Why not?" The dam broke. 5 years of holding everything together, of being strong for Tyler, of swallowing her pride and her hunger and her exhaustion. It all came pouring out in words she couldn't control. "Because I have nothing, Mr. Blake." Her voice rose, trembling with emotion. "Because I work 2 jobs and I still can't make rent. Because my son asked me yesterday why we never eat dinner together. And the truth is, there's usually only enough for one of us. Because I gave him the last of our food yesterday morning, and I hadn't eaten in 2 days and I was so hungry, I couldn't think straight." Tears streamed down her face, and she didn't bother wiping them away. "Because people like me don't ask people like you for anything. Because the moment I do, I become a charity case, a problem to be solved or ignored, and I may not have much, but I still have my dignity." Her voice broke on the last word. "Or I did. Until last night." The silence that followed was absolute. Mariah waited for the inevitable, the dismissal, the disappointment, the cold professional distance. Instead, Jonathan Blake did something she never expected. He stood up, walked to the cabinet, and pulled out 2 plates. Mariah watched, confused and still trembling, as Jonathan moved through the kitchen with an uncertainty that seemed foreign to him. He opened the refrigerator, stared at its contents for a long moment, then pulled out eggs, butter, and a carton of fresh orange juice. "When was the last time you ate a real meal?" he asked, his back still to her. She wiped at her tears with the back of her hand. "Mr. Blake, you don't have to answer the question, please." His tone wasn't harsh, but it was firm. "Sunday." The admission felt like pulling shrapnel from a wound. "When I had half a sandwich at the diner, they let us eat the mistakes." He turned to face her, a carton of eggs in his hand, and something in his expression had shifted. The distant employer was gone, replaced by someone who looked almost lost. "Sunday. Today is Thursday." "I'm used to it," she said quickly, defensive. "I'm fine. Tyler eats every day. That's what matters. Tyler is your son. He's 7. A small smile broke through despite everything. "He's smart, so smart. He wants to be a scientist when he grows up. He loves asking questions about how things work." Jonathan set the eggs on the counter and crossed his arms, leaning against the island. For a moment, he seemed to be wrestling with something internal, some decision that required more effort than it should have. "I'm going to make breakfast," he finally said, "and you're going to eat it. Not because you work for me, not because I feel sorry for you, but because no one should go 4 days without eating. Can we agree on that much?" Mariah wanted to refuse. Every fiber of her being screamed that accepting would change something fundamental between them, would shift her from employee to charity case. But her body betrayed her. Her stomach growled audibly in the quiet kitchen, and she was too exhausted to maintain the pretense. "Okay," she whispered. She expected him to call his private chef, or to pull out some pre-made gourmet meal. Instead, Jonathan Blake, tech millionaire and recluse, cracked eggs into a bowl with the careful concentration of someone who didn't do this often. "I should warn you," he said, whisking the eggs. "I'm not very good at this. My wife used to cook. After I mostly just have the chef prepare things." It was the first personal thing he'd ever shared with her. Mariah sat very still, afraid that speaking might break whatever fragile thing was forming between them. "How do you like your eggs?" he asked. "However they come out is fine." He shot her a look, brief but pointed. "How do you like your eggs, Mrs. Evans?" Something in his insistence made her smile despite herself. "Scrambled, with cheese, if you have it. I have 17 types of cheese. Sarah used to make fun of me for it." He opened the refrigerator again and pulled out a block of sharp cheddar. "She said I was preparing for some apocalypse where the only currency would be dairy products." The way he said her name, Sarah, was careful, like testing weight on a frozen lake. Mariah recognized the sound. She made it too, when she spoke about Tyler's father, the boyfriend who'd left when he found out she was pregnant. They cooked together in a silence that was surprisingly comfortable. Jonathan scrambled eggs while Mariah, unable to just sit, made toast and poured orange juice. It felt surreal, like stepping into someone else's life, a life where employers and employees shared breakfast, where millionaires made scrambled eggs in wrinkled shirts. When they sat down at the breakfast nook, plates full, Mariah felt tears threatening again. The simple act of having food in front of her, of not having to choose between eating and feeding her son, was overwhelming. "Before you eat," Jonathan said, and she looked up, worried he'd changed his mind. "I need to say something." He set down his fork and met her eyes with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "I've spent 5 years in this house, Mrs. Evans, 5 years ordering more food than I could eat, throwing away enough groceries to feed a family. I've been so focused on my own pain, my own loss, that I stopped seeing anything else, anyone else." He paused, and she saw his jaw tighten. "Yesterday, I threw away 3 full meals, while you were working in my home, hungry enough to risk your job for cold pasta. Mr. Blake, I'm not finished." His voice was gentle, but insistent. "What I'm trying to say is that I'm sorry. I'm sorry I created an environment where you felt you couldn't ask for help, where you had to sneak food like a criminal. That's on me, not you." Mariah didn't know what to say. In her entire working life, she'd never had an employer apologize to her for anything. "Now eat," he said, picking up his fork again, "before it gets cold. And please, call me Jonathan." She took a bite of the scrambled eggs. They were slightly overcooked and undersalted, but they were the best thing she'd tasted in months. Not because of the food itself, but because someone had seen her, really seen her. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Mariah didn't feel invisible. The following days brought a shift so subtle that Mariah almost convinced herself she'd imagined it. But Jonathan was there more often now. Not hovering, but present. He'd appear in the kitchen while she worked, making coffee or sorting through mail, offering quiet good mornings that felt like olive branches. On Friday, she found a note on the counter beside a stack of containers. "Please take these home. They'll only go to waste otherwise." The containers held enough food for a week. Mariah stood there for 10 minutes, staring at the note, his careful handwriting, the casual generosity that probably meant nothing to him but everything to her. She thought about refusing, about maintaining the professional boundary that had already been irreparably blurred. Then she thought about Tyler's face when she'd had to tell him they couldn't afford the class field trip to the science center. She took the containers home. That weekend, Tyler ate salmon for the first time in his life. He pronounced it weird but good, and asked if they were rich now. Mariah laughed and cried at the same time, holding her son in their tiny kitchen while he chattered about molecules and atoms, his belly finally full. By the following Tuesday, something had fundamentally changed in the Blake household. Jonathan began eating lunch at regular times, and Mariah noticed he started requesting meals for two. He never said anything directly, but when noon arrived and she prepared the chef's planned menu, there were always 2 plates. The first time she sat down across from him, after 15 minutes of insistence on his part, Mariah felt like she was violating some natural law. But Jonathan asked about Tyler, about his interests, about what 7-year-olds thought about these days. She found herself talking more than she had in years, sharing stories she didn't realize she'd been storing up. "He wants to know how airplanes fly," she said, smiling at the memory of Tyler's latest obsession. "He asked me to explain lift and thrust, and I had to admit I didn't really know. I felt like I was failing him." "You're not failing him." Jonathan's response was immediate and firm. "You're working 2 jobs to keep him fed and housed. That's not failure, that's heroism." The word sat uncomfortably on her. "I'm not a hero. I'm just doing what I have to do." "That's exactly what makes it heroic." He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "My father died when I was 8. My mother worked 3 jobs, cleaning offices at night, waiting tables during the day, and doing alterations on weekends. I remember her falling asleep standing up once, leaning against the kitchen counter. His eyes had gone distant, focused on something only he could see. I spent my whole life trying to make enough money so she'd never have to work again. By the time I did, she'd passed away." Mariah saw the grief beneath his words, the regret that money couldn't fix. "I'm sorry. Don't be. I'm telling you because I recognize what you're doing, what it costs." He met her eyes. "And because Tyler deserves to understand how airplanes fly." 3 days later, a package arrived addressed to Tyler Evans, care of the Blake residence. Inside were 3 children's science books, about flight, about space, about the physics of everyday life. The card read, "For a future scientist, keep asking questions. Jonathan Blake." Mariah found Jonathan in his office that evening before she left. She held the books against her chest like they were made of gold. You didn't have to do this." "I know." He looked up from his laptop, and she noticed he seemed less tired than before, less like a ghost haunting his own home. "But I wanted to." "Is that allowed?" She didn't trust herself to speak, so she just nodded. "How is he?" "Tyler?" Jonathan asked, and the genuine interest in his voice startled her. "He's good. He's everything." She struggled to find words that could encompass what her son meant to her. "Sometimes I look at him and I can't believe I made something so perfect. Even when everything else is falling apart, I have him. He's lucky to have you. I'm lucky to have him." She shifted her weight, still uncomfortable with praise. "He keeps me going on the days when I want to give up." Something flickered across Jonathan's face. Recognition, perhaps, or remembrance. Sarah used to say that about her work, that it kept her going even when the cancer was eating her alive. She was a pediatric oncologist. He spoke slowly, as if the words had to travel through layers of ice to reach his mouth. She spent her last coherent day at the hospital, reading to the kids in the terminal ward. That's who she was. She sounds like she was amazing. She was. He turned back to his laptop, and Mariah recognized the gesture, the retreat when vulnerability became too much. "Tyler's welcome to use the library here, by the way, if he wants." I have quite a few science books that are just collecting dust. It was an offering, carefully neutral, that meant more than the words implied. An invitation into a life that had been closed for 5 years. I think he'd like that, Mariah said softly. Thank you, Jonathan. It was the first time she'd used his first name. He noticed. She saw the slight pause in his typing, the almost imperceptible softening in his shoulders. You're welcome, Mariah. Outside, the Seattle rain had started again, but inside the Blake mansion, something warmer than weather was taking root. 3 weeks had passed since the confrontation in the kitchen, and the Blake mansion had transformed in ways that had nothing to do with Mariah's cleaning. There was laughter now, quiet, tentative, but real. Tyler had visited twice, his wide eyes taking in the library with its floor-to-ceiling shelves, and Jonathan had spent an entire Saturday afternoon explaining aerodynamics using paper airplanes and complicated hand gestures. Mariah had watched from the doorway, her heart doing something complicated in her chest as this lonely, broken man taught her son about Bernoulli's principle with more patience than she'd seen in any teacher. But good things, in Mariah's experience, never lasted long. It started with a cough, just a small thing, Tyler clearing his throat more than usual, complaining that his chest felt funny. By Wednesday, he had a fever. By Friday, Mariah was in the emergency room at Harborview Medical Center, watching doctors exchange worried glances over her son's labored breathing. Pneumonia, the attending physician said, his face professionally neutral. We need to admit him. His oxygen saturation is low, and given his symptoms, we want to monitor him closely. The world narrowed to a pinpoint. Mariah heard herself asking questions. How long? What treatment? Will he be okay? But her voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. All she could see was Tyler in the hospital bed, so small against the white sheets, his breathing shallow and rapid. Do you have insurance? The admissions coordinator asked, clipboard in hand. Aye. Mariah's mind raced. She had the basic catastrophic coverage from the diner, the bare minimum required by law, but it came with a deductible she couldn't afford, and coverage so limited it was nearly worthless. Yes, but we'll need the information, and there'll be a deposit for the admission. Numbers swam in front of her eyes. $5,000 deductible, 20% co-insurance after that, hospital stay, medications, oxygen therapy, potential ICU care if things got worse. She did the math automatically, a skill honed by years of poverty. The total could easily reach $15,000, $20,000. Money she didn't have, money she couldn't borrow, money that stood between her son and the care he needed. Can I? Her voice cracked. Can I make payments? The coordinator's expression softened with practiced sympathy. We can work something out. Let's just focus on getting Tyler stable first. But Mariah knew what that meant. She'd seen the collection notices, heard the stories from other single mothers at the diner. Medical debt that followed you for years, that destroyed credit, that made it impossible to rent a decent apartment or finance a reliable car. The kind of debt that pushed people from struggling to drowning. She spent that night in a chair beside Tyler's bed, watching the monitors track his heartbeat and oxygen levels, listening to his wheezy breathing. She held his small hand and made promises she didn't know how to keep, that everything would be okay, that Mommy would take care of it, that he just needed to focus on getting better. At 3 a.m, she stepped into the hallway and called the Blake house. She'd never used the personal number Jonathan had given her, saved in her phone under Jonathan Emergency Only. But if this wasn't an emergency, nothing was. It rang 4 times. Then his voice, groggy with sleep. Mariah, I'm sorry. The words tumbled out. I'm so sorry to call. I know it's late. I needed to let you know I won't be in tomorrow, or maybe for a few days. Tyler's in the hospital and... Which hospital? His voice was suddenly alert, sharp with concern. Harborview. But Mr. Blake, Jonathan, I just needed to tell you I can't work right now. I'll make up the hours. I promise. I just need... I'm coming there. No. The word came out too loud. An elderly woman in the hallway waiting area looked over. Mariah lowered her voice. No, you don't need to do that. I just wanted to explain why I'd be missing work. Mariah. He said her name like he was trying to anchor her to reality. Tell me what room you're in. Jonathan, please. This isn't your problem. What room? She gave him the number because she was too tired to argue, too overwhelmed to maintain the walls between employer and employee, between his world and hers. After she hung up, She sat in the sterile hallway, fluorescent lights humming overhead, and let herself cry for the first time since the ambulance had arrived. She cried for Tyler, struggling to breathe in that hospital bed. She cried for the bills that would bury them. She cried for the life she'd tried so hard to build that was crumbling with every labored breath her son took. And somewhere in that crying, she admitted something she'd been avoiding for weeks. She'd started depending on Jonathan Blake's kindness, started believing that maybe, for once, someone would be there when she fell. But depending on people was how you got hurt, how you ended up disappointed and alone. Mariah wiped her face and stood up, straightening her shoulders. Tyler needed her strong. Whatever came next, she'd handle it the way she'd handled everything else in her life, by herself. She didn't need Jonathan Blake's charity. She didn't need anyone. The lie felt thin even to her own ears, but she held on to it anyway. It was all she had left. Jonathan arrived at Harborview Medical Center 40 minutes after Mariah's call, still wearing the sweatpants he'd fallen asleep in, a jacket thrown hastily over a wrinkled t-shirt. His hair was uncombed, his face unshaven. He looked more human than she'd ever seen him. He found her in the waiting area, hunched over a styrofoam cup of terrible coffee, staring at nothing. When she looked up and saw him, something in her expression crumbled before she quickly rebuilt it. "You shouldn't have come," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "How is he?" Jonathan sat down beside her, maintaining a careful distance. "Stable. For now. They have him on oxygen and antibiotics. The doctor said the next 48 hours are critical." She said it clinically, like reciting facts would make them less terrifying. "Pneumonia. It came on so fast. Yesterday he was just coughing. And now?" Her voice broke. She pressed her hand to her mouth, trying to hold back the sob that was fighting its way out. Jonathan did something then that surprised both of them. He reached over and took her free hand, squeezing it gently, not saying anything, just being present. Mariah held on like a drowning person gripping a lifeline. They sat like that for several minutes, the hospital moving around them, nurses changing shifts, families having whispered conversations, machines beeping out their steady rhythms of life and crisis. "I can't afford this," Mariah finally whispered. "The hospital bills. Even with insurance, it's going to be thousands, maybe tens of thousands. I've been doing the math in my head, and there's no scenario where I can pay for this. None." "Then don't." She looked at him sharply. "What?" "Don't pay for it." "I will." The words hung between them, simple and impossible. Mariah pulled her hand away from his, anger flaring up from somewhere deep. "No, absolutely not." "Mariah, no." She stood up, needing distance, needing to move.
"You've already done too much. The food, the books for Tyler, being kind when you didn't have to be. But this is different. This is..." She struggled to find words big enough. "This is my responsibility. My son, my problem." Jonathan stood too, his voice calm but firm. "It's not charity if it's what friends do for each other." "We're not friends." The words came out harsher than she intended, but she couldn't take them back.
Couldn't let herself take them back. "You're my employer. I'm your housekeeper. That's all this is. All it can be." "Is it?" He took a step closer, and she saw something in his eyes she couldn't quite name. "Because I thought, these past few weeks, I thought we'd become something more than that." "You thought wrong." Mariah wrapped her arms around herself, defensive. "You're a good man, Jonathan. You've been generous and kind, and I'm grateful. But I won't become some charity case for you to feel good about helping. That's not what this is." "Then what is it?" Her voice rose, drawing looks from other people in the waiting area. She lowered it to an angry whisper. "You swoop in and save the poor single mother, write a check and make all the problems disappear. That's not real life, not my life. When Tyler gets out of here, you'll go back to your mansion and I'll go back to my apartment with bills I can't pay and a son who needs things I can't afford. That's reality. It doesn't have to be." "Yes, it does." The shout escaped before she could stop it. "Because people like you don't stay in the lives of people like me. You get bored, or you realize we're too much work, or you find some other project that needs saving, and then where does that leave Tyler? Where does that leave me? Worse off than before because we got used to having something we can never really keep." Jonathan flinched like she'd struck him. "You think that's who I am? Someone who would use you and your son as a temporary distraction?" "I think you're lonely and grieving, and we're convenient. A widow and an orphan for you to rescue so you don't have to deal with your own pain. The silence that followed was brutal. Mariah watched the hurt move across Jonathan's face, watched him process the accusation. Part of her wanted to take it back, to apologize, but a larger part, the part that had learned survival meant building walls, kept her mouth shut. Is that really what you think? His voice was quiet, controlled, but she could hear the anger underneath. After everything, that's what you believe? I don't know what to believe anymore. Mariah was so tired. Tired of being strong, tired of fighting, tired of hoping for things she couldn't have. I just know that I can't accept your money. I can't accept your help. Because when it stops, and it will stop, I need to still be able to look at myself in the mirror. So that's it. You'd rather drown in debt than let someone help you? Yes. The word was final, absolute. Because at least that way, I'm drowning on my own terms. Jonathan stared at her for a long moment, and she watched something shut down in his expression. A door closing, a light going out. He nodded slowly, like he'd reached some internal decision. Fine, he said. I'll respect your wishes. But understand this, Mariah. I wasn't trying to save you. I was trying to be your friend. There's a difference. He turned and walked toward the elevator, his footsteps echoing on the linoleum floor. Mariah watched him go, her chest tight, her eyes burning. She wanted to call him back, to explain, to apologize, but she didn't. She just stood there, alone again, and told herself this was better, this was safer, even if it felt like she'd just lost something irreplaceable. Tyler's condition worsened before it improved. By Sunday evening, his fever had spiked to 104 degrees, and the doctors moved him to the pediatric ICU. Mariah sat by his bedside, watching the machines breathe for him, feeling her world compressed to the rise and fall of his small chest. She hadn't slept in 3 days, hadn't left the hospital except to move her car when parking enforcement threatened to tow it. She survived on vending machine coffee and the kind of fear that lived in your bones, that made every alarm on every monitor feel like the end of the world. Mrs. Chen from the diner had fired her, not unkindly. She couldn't hold the position open indefinitely. She'd explained over a crackling phone connection. Mariah had thanked her and hung up before the crying started. That was Friday. By Sunday, she'd stopped crying altogether. There were no tears left. The hospital bills arrived in her patient portal like digital harbingers of doom. 18,000 so far, and Tyler was still in ICU. The number was abstract, meaningless, monopoly money she'd never have. She stared at the figures until they blurred, then closed her laptop and went back to watching her son breathe. She thought about Jonathan constantly, despite trying not to, replayed their argument in obsessive detail, examining every word like evidence at a crime scene. Had she been too harsh, too proud? Had she thrown away the best thing that had happened to her in years because she was too damaged to accept kindness? Or had she been right to protect herself and Tyler from inevitable disappointment? The questions circled endlessly, but they didn't matter. What mattered was Tyler, only Tyler. On Monday morning, a woman in an expensive navy suit appeared at Tyler's door. She introduced herself as Patricia Morrison, patient advocate. Mrs. Evans, I wanted to discuss your account with you. Mariah's stomach dropped. I know I owe. I'm going to set up a payment plan. I just need. Actually, Patricia interrupted gently. That's what I came to tell you. Your account has been settled. The words didn't make sense. Mariah blinked, trying to process. Settled. Paid in full. All current charges, and we've been instructed to forward any future charges related to Tyler's care to the same benefactor. Who? But Mariah already knew. She felt it like a punch to the chest. No, that's not. I didn't authorize that. Patricia's expression was professionally neutral, but something like sympathy flickered beneath it. The benefactor wishes to remain anonymous, but they were very clear. All of Tyler's medical expenses are covered. You don't need to worry about the financial aspect of his care. I need to know who did this. I'm not at liberty to say. It was Jonathan Blake, wasn't it? Mariah's voice was shaking. Damn it, tell me. Was it him? Patricia's silence was answer enough. After the patient advocate left, Mariah stood at Tyler's window, looking out at the Seattle skyline, the Space Needle rising in the distance. Rain streaked the glass, blurring the city into watercolors. Her phone felt heavy in her pocket. Jonathan's number right there, one call away. She wanted to scream at him, wanted to thank him, wanted to collapse into his arms and sob with relief and rage and something she couldn't name. Instead, she did nothing. Because what could she say? That he'd violated her wishes? That he'd saved her son's life and she was angry about it? That his kindness felt like it was breaking her because she didn't know how to accept it without losing herself? Tyler stirred in his bed, his eyes fluttering open. "Mama?" Mariah was at his side instantly, taking his small hand. "I'm here, baby. I'm right here." "Thirsty?" he whispered, his voice hoarse from the breathing tube they'd removed that morning. She helped him sip water through a straw, her heart expanding with relief at this small sign of improvement. His fever had broken overnight. The antibiotics were working. Her boy was coming back to her. "Mama, where's Mr. Jonathan?" Tyler asked, his eyes still heavy with medication. "Is he coming to visit?" The question was innocent, but it cut deep. In 3 short weeks, Jonathan had become important to Tyler, someone who explained science, who listened with genuine interest, who treated a 7-year-old like his questions mattered. "I don't know, sweetheart," Mariah said honestly. "He's been very busy. I miss him." Tyler's eyes were already closing again, exhaustion pulling him back under. "He's nice, like a friend." Mariah sat back down in her chair, Tyler's words echoing in her head. Like a friend. That's what Jonathan had said too, wasn't it? That he was trying to be her friend. And what had she done? Accused him of using them. Told him they could never be more than employer and employee. Pushed him away with all the force of her pride and fear. She pulled out her phone, typed and deleted a dozen messages. "Thank you. I'm sorry. I was wrong. Please forgive me. I don't know how to do this." But none of the words felt adequate. None of them could bridge the gap she'd created. In the end, she sent nothing. Outside, the rain continued to fall, and inside, Mariah Evans sat with her sleeping son and the crushing weight of her own stubbornness, wondering if some bridges, once burned, could ever be rebuilt. Tyler was discharged on a Thursday afternoon, 12 days after he'd been admitted. The doctors gave Mariah a folder full of instructions, medications, follow-up appointments, warning signs to watch for. She nodded through all of it, her mind a blur of relief and exhaustion. The ride home in her battered Toyota felt surreal. Tyler sat in the back seat, pale and thinner but alive, chattering about the nurse who'd let him listen to his own heartbeat and the IV that had made his arm feel like a robot. Mariah kept glancing in the rearview mirror, needing constant confirmation that he was really there, really okay. Their apartment felt smaller than she remembered. The walls needed paint, the carpet was stained, the November cold seeped through the single-pane windows. But it was home. It was theirs. That night, after settling Tyler into bed with his new medications and a kiss on his forehead, Mariah sat at their tiny kitchen table and forced herself to look at her situation clearly. She'd lost her job at the diner. Her position at the Blake Mansion, she had no idea if it still existed. She had $17 in her checking account. Rent was due in 5 days. The electricity bill was 3 weeks overdue. And someone had paid $23,000 in medical bills for her son. Someone who she'd accused of using them as a project. Mariah put her head in her hands. She'd been so determined to maintain her independence, her dignity, that she'd rejected the one genuine connection she'd made in years. And for what? To prove she could suffer alone. To demonstrate that she didn't need anyone. Pride, her mother used to say, was just fear in a fancy dress. She pulled out her phone and stared at Jonathan's number for the 100th time. Her thumb hovered over the call button before she set the phone down. A phone call felt inadequate, cowardly. If she was going to apologize, and she needed to apologize, it had to be in person. But what if he didn't want to see her? What if she'd burned that bridge beyond repair? The thought made her chest ache, but she pushed through it. She owed him at least the attempt. The Friday morning, Mariah called Mrs. Rodriguez, the neighbor who sometimes watched Tyler, and asked if she could spare a few hours. Then she drove to Laurelhurst, her heart pounding harder with every mile. The iron gate opened when she entered her code. That was something, at least. She hadn't been locked out. The mansion looked exactly the same, elegant and imposing against the gray November sky. But it felt different now, like a place she'd lost the right to enter. She used her key to the service entrance, old habits taking over. The kitchen was spotless. A new housekeeper, probably. Someone more professional, less complicated. The thought stung more than it should have. Mariah found Jonathan in his office, sitting at his desk with his back to the door, staring at something on his laptop. For a moment, she just watched him, taking in the familiar line of his shoulders, the way his hand came up to rub the back of his neck. A gesture she'd learned meant he was stressed. "Jonathan." Her voice came out smaller than she'd intended. He turned, and the surprise on his face quickly shifted to something more guarded. He stood, professional distance settling over him like armor. "Mariah, how's Tyler?" "He's home. He's going to be okay." She took a step into the office, her hands twisted together. "Thanks to you. I'm glad he's recovering." The formality in his voice was worse than anger would have been. This was the man who'd made her scrambled eggs, who'd taught her son about physics, who'd held her hand in a hospital waiting room, and she'd reduced him back to a stranger. "And Jonathan, She stopped, trying to find words that wouldn't sound hollow. "I came to apologize, and to thank you, for the hospital bills, for everything. You made it clear you didn't want my help. I know. She swallowed hard. "I was scared. I'm still scared, if I'm being honest. Because accepting help means admitting I can't do everything alone. And if I can't do everything alone, then what does that make me? Human," he said quietly. "And it makes you human." Tears pricked at her eyes. "I spent so long building walls to protect Tyler and myself, making sure we didn't depend on anyone, didn't trust anyone because everyone who was supposed to be there left. Tyler's father, my own family when they found out I was pregnant. I learned that the only person I could count on was me. And then I came along. And then you came along." She agreed. "And you were kind and patient. And you saw me, really saw me, in a way no one has in years. And that terrified me. Because if I let myself need you, if I let Tyler care about you, and then you left," her voice broke. "I couldn't survive that. I couldn't watch my son survive that." Jonathan was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft. "I lost Sarah 5 years ago. Mariah. 5 years of living in this house like a ghost, avoiding anything that might make me feel something. Do you know what you and Tyler did? You made me feel alive again. You reminded me that there's more to life than just existing." He took a step toward her. "But I understand fear. I understand wanting to protect yourself. What I don't understand is you thinking I'd abandon you the moment things got difficult. That's not who I am." "I know that now," Mariah whispered. "I think I knew it then too. But knowing something and trusting it are different things. So where does that leave us?" It was the question she'd been asking herself all night. The answer required more courage than anything she'd ever done. "I'd like to try again," she said. "If you'll let me. Not as employer and employee, as friends. Real friends. The kind who help each other and trust each other and maybe sometimes eat scrambled eggs together." A smile tugged at the corner of Jonathan's mouth, the first genuine expression since she'd entered the room. "I make terrible scrambled eggs. I know. They're always overcooked and undersalted. That too." They stood there, 3 feet apart, the space between them charged with possibility. Then Jonathan closed the distance and pulled her into a hug, careful, respectful, but warm. Mariah let herself lean into it, let herself accept the comfort she'd been denying herself. "Friends," Jonathan said against her hair, "we can start there." And for the first time in 12 days, Mariah felt like she could breathe. 6 months later, spring had come to Seattle with the kind of gentle insistence that made even the perpetually gray city seem hopeful. Cherry blossoms lined the streets of Laurelhurst, petals drifting like pink snow across Jonathan Blake's driveway. Inside the mansion, things had changed in ways both subtle and profound. Mariah still worked there, but her role had evolved into something the employment paperwork called home manager, a position that came with actual benefits, reasonable hours, and a salary that meant she could afford a 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood with good schools. More importantly, it came with flexibility for Tyler's doctor appointments and the evening classes she'd started taking. Nursing school, the dream she'd shelved at 19, was slowly, carefully being rebuilt. But the biggest change wasn't reflected in any job description or paycheck. It was in the way the house felt, lived in, warm, human. There were photos on the mantel now, including one of Sarah that Jonathan had finally felt strong enough to display. Tyler's science projects occupied a corner of the library. The kitchen often smelled like actual cooking, not just reheated gourmet meals. On this particular Saturday afternoon, Tyler sat at the breakfast nook with Jonathan, both of them hunched over a model rocket kit, debating the proper angle for the fins. "If we make them too steep," Tyler explained with the seriousness only a 7-year-old could muster, "we'll get too much drag." "Mr. Jonathan, are you even listening?" Jonathan looked up from his phone, guilty. Sorry, buddy. Work email. It's Saturday. Mariah called from where she was preparing lunch, an actual Saturday, her day off. But she'd gotten into the habit of spending time here even when she wasn't working. They all had. The work email can wait. Yes, ma'am. Jonathan set his phone aside with exaggerated ceremony, earning a giggle from Tyler. Mariah watched them together, something warm settling in her chest. Jonathan had been attending therapy regularly. He'd shared that with her one evening, over wine on the back patio, admitting how much he'd needed it, how much he was learning about himself, about grief, about connection. She'd started therapy too. It turned out that years of survival mode left damage that needed tending, wounds that deserved attention. Her therapist, Dr. Chen, had helped her understand that accepting help wasn't weakness. It was wisdom. Mom. Tyler's excited voice pulled her back to the present. Can we launch it today, please? After lunch, she said, bringing over sandwiches. And only if Mr. Jonathan thinks it's ready. Mr. Jonathan thinks we need to let the glue dry properly, Jonathan said, ruffling Tyler's hair. But tomorrow? Tomorrow we launch. They ate lunch together, the conversation flowing easily. Tyler's upcoming science fair project, Mariah's midterm exams, Jonathan's plans to finally do something with Sarah's foundation beyond just funding it. He wanted to be involved again, he said, to honor her memory by living, not just by writing checks. After Tyler went outside to play in the garden, carefully supervised through the window, Mariah and Jonathan cleaned up together, moving around each other with the comfortable choreography of people who'd learned each other's rhythms. I have something for you, Jonathan said, drying the last plate. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Mariah's heart jumped. Jonathan! It's not what you think, he said quickly, laughing at her expression. Open it. Inside was a delicate silver necklace with a small pendant, a tree with spreading branches and visible roots. It reminded me of something you said once, Jonathan explained, suddenly less confident, about how the strongest trees are the ones with deep roots, about how growth means staying grounded while still reaching upward. Mariah touched the pendant gently, her eyes stinging with tears. Oh, it's beautiful. I wanted you to have something that represents what you've accomplished, what you're still accomplishing. He paused, then added more quietly, and what you've helped me accomplish. I'm not the same person I was 6 months ago. Hell, I'm not the same person I was a year ago. Neither am I, Mariah said softly. Is that a good thing? She thought about it, really thought about it. The woman who'd stood in this kitchen 6 months ago, eating cold pasta and crying, felt like a different person. She'd been so focused on survival that she'd forgotten about living, so determined to be independent that she'd built a prison instead of a foundation. Now she had friends, had dreams, had a support system that included not just Jonathan, but the community they'd been building. The other parents at Tyler's school, her classmates, even Mrs. Rodriguez next door. Yes, she finally answered. It's a good thing. A really good thing. Jonathan smiled, that genuine, unguarded smile she'd worked so hard to earn. Good, because I have a proposal for you. Another one, she teased. You're full of surprises today. Sarah's foundation. I want to expand it. Focus on supporting single parents, specifically helping with childcare costs and education funding. And I want you to help me run it. Mariah stared at him. Jonathan, I'm still in nursing school. I don't have any experience with. You have the only experience that matters. You've lived it. He leaned against the counter. Serious now. This isn't charity, Mariah. This is using our resources, my money, your insight, our combined determination to help people who are where you were, where my mother was. It's giving them the hand up that can make all the difference. Outside, Tyler's laughter rang out, pure and joyful. Mariah looked at her son, then at Jonathan, then at the pendant in her hand, roots and branches, growth and stability, the symbol of everything she'd learned about balance. Okay, she said. Yes, let's do it. Jonathan's face lit up, and impulsively, he pulled her into a hug. This time, she didn't hesitate, didn't overthink it. She just hugged him back, letting herself feel grateful, hopeful, and yes, happy. They pulled apart, both a little embarrassed, both smiling. So, Jonathan said, partners. Partners. Mariah agreed, and maybe, someday, something more. But for now, this was enough. More than enough. Through the window, Tyler called for them to come see something he'd discovered in the garden. They went together, Jonathan holding the door open for Mariah, both of them stepping out into the spring sunshine. Behind them, the Blake mansion stood as it always had, solid, imposing, expensive, but it wasn't empty anymore. It wasn't a fortress or a prison. It was, finally, a home. And sometimes, Mariah thought as Tyler showed them the caterpillar he'd found, that's the most valuable thing of all, not the money or the security or even the opportunities, but the simple, profound gift of not being alone, of being seen, being valued, being enough exactly as you are. That, she'd learned, was what changed everything. The end. Did you like this story? Would you have done anything differently? Tell me in the comments. See you next time. Don't forget to like and subscribe now to receive more exciting stories that you won't want to miss. Thank you very much.